Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Red Velvet Pot de Crème. That's right, inspired by the famous cake. I'm going to show you how to make a very, very fancy French-style chocolate pudding. And when people hear the words fancy French, they think complicated. But this is actually very simple to make. And everyone's going to love it, especially your Valentine. And to get started, what we'll need is 3 egg yolks, as well as some whole milk, some cream, plus a little touch of cream cheese to help give us those red velvet vibes. And then, of course, we'll also need some semi-sweet chocolate. And if you're keeping score at home, I'm using a 62% cacao. And then we'll also do a little bit of optional red food coloring to get that signature mahogany color. And then besides a little bit of vanilla and a pinch of salt, that's going to be it for the ingredients. And then what we'll do is add our egg yolks, milk, and cream to a saucepan. Since we're doing a much easier stovetop version of this, right, pot de crème is usually baked in the oven, but I really do prefer this method. And once everything's in there, we'll take our whisk and pop those yolks, and then we'll give everything a nice whisking before we head to the stove, where we will place this over medium heat, and then we'll cook it, stirring pretty much constantly until the mixture gets very hot, but does not yet come to a simmer. And I don't always use the best techniques, and sometimes I'll just stick with the whisk for this, which I have to admit will work, but probably not as well as a spatula, since that much larger, flatter edge is going to scrape along the bottom of the pan, and it really does lessen the chances that parts start to stick. But either way, like I said, we're going to want to cook this until it's very hot and reaches a temp of about 160, which I like to check using one of these laser thermometers. But you can also just watch and observe, and when it gets super steamy, and it's very, very hot to the touch, you're probably fine. Okay, something to keep in mind, we are not relying on this mixture getting thick to thicken our final dessert. Right, that's going to be taken care of by the chocolates, and a little bit by the cream cheese. So it's not like we're waiting for this mixture to get thick. And like I said, when it gets steaming hot, and it's about 160 degrees, we will stop, and we will pull that off the heat. And then very quickly, but carefully, we will transfer in our broken up chocolate, and we'll give that pan a little bit of a gentle swirling. And what we want to do here is let that sit for about 2 minutes to allow that chocolate to get nice and soft before we whisk everything together. And during that time, we can add a few more of our ingredients, including our pinch of salt, our vanilla extract, as well as, if we're using it, our red food coloring. And by the way, I highly recommend using the gel style, since you only need a little bit, versus the liquid food coloring, where you might need a couple teaspoons, which can sometimes screw up the texture. But anyway, we'll give that another swirl. And once our chocolate has been melting for a couple minutes, we will add our cream cheese, and then we'll take a whisk and start mixing this together. And while I do, let me go over a couple things. All right, first of all, don't be in a big hurry to mix in the cream cheese. All right, we can first focus on getting that melted chocolate nicely mixed in. And once that starts to happen, we can start breaking up the cream cheese and incorporating that as well. And then the other thing I'll tell you is do not be concerned about the color yet. Okay, that color is going to be a lot more vibrant at this point. But you'll see as the chocolate cools and the dessert sets in the fridge, it's going to become more muted. And as you'll see, we'll eventually end up with that beautiful mahogany color. Oh, and then the last thing I'll mention is depending on the brand of cream cheese, it might mix in perfectly just with the whisk. But if it doesn't, and you notice little tiny specks of cream cheese, feel free to grab your stick blender or toss this into a blender and just blend it for a few seconds on high. And that should result in a perfectly smooth mixture. But either way, once everything's mixed, and before it starts to harden up, we're going to want to transfer this to whatever we're going to serve this in, which for me are going to be these little 4-ounce canning jars, which are the perfect size. Plus, since it's clear glass, we get to see that beautiful, hopefully very red velvet-like color. And then once those are filled up, we have a very, very important step to do before we chill these, especially if we did end up using a blender, which is going to cause bubbles. All right, what we want to do before these go in the fridge is give them the old tappa, which is going to bring up any air bubbles to the surface and help produce a denser, smoother texture. All right, we're not trying to make a light, airy mousse. Okay, we're trying to simulate a classic oven-baked pot de crème. And that's it. We can go ahead and wrap those up and pop them in the fridge until they're totally cold and firm, which for me was overnight, but you could get away with a couple hours probably. And once we're ready to serve, we can garnish that with a piping of sweetened whipped cream, or in my case, whipped cream with a little bit of cream cheese in there. Oh, and don't forget to turn the jar while you're doing it, so you get that extra sexy swirl. And yes, I'll give you the ingredients for that topping in the recipe. And then for a final touch, we will dust this with a little bit of cocoa. All right, not too much. All right, we're trying to highlight, not cover up our super sexy swirl. And that's it, what I'm calling red velvet pot de crème was ready to enjoy. And that, my friends, as far as special occasion chocolate desserts go, is just about as good as it gets. Right, this is plenty rich and fairly decadent, but still somehow kind of light. And one thing that makes this really interesting to eat is that little bit of tanginess you get from the cream cheese, which is why that stuff always works so well in a frosting. Although if we're being honest, I took some artistic liberties using the name red velvet. Right, a red velvet cake really isn't that chocolatey, whereas this is very chocolatey. And yes, I'm usually a dark chocolate guy, but for this specific dessert, I think semi-sweet's the way to go. But having said that, pretty much any chocolate's gonna work, so use what you want. I mean, you are, after all, the Dominique Crenn of this fast and easy way to make pot de crème. And of course, you could just buy a fancy chocolate dessert for your Valentine. But taking the time and putting forth the effort to make a homemade chocolate dessert, I think is so much nicer and thoughtful. And I think very much increases your chances of getting lots of compliments. But whether you do make this for a special occasion like Valentine's Day, or just some weeknight, no matter when you make this, it is super easy, very delicious, and incredibly gorgeous. And I really do hope you give it a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.